Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Health Hazard Awareness webinar with Georgia Tech Safety, Health, and Environmental Services team. My name is Lauren Roberts, and I'm the Program Specialist at the Atlanta MBDA Business and Advanced Manufacturing Centers here at Georgia Tech. And on behalf of the Minority Business Development Agency, or MBDA, and our MBDA centers and Georgia Tech, I welcome you. We're excited to host you today and hope to answer any questions you may have about health hazards in the workplace. So before we begin, I just want to give a brief overview of our agenda. After some brief opening remarks from me, I'll turn things over to our Georgia Tech SHES team. They'll deliver their presentation, and afterwards I will facilitate a question and answer session. And after that, I will deliver my closing remarks and briefly discuss some upcoming events. I would like to take a moment to thank our corporate sponsors. Thank you to the Minority Business Development Agency, our federal sponsor for our centers and programs. I'd also like to thank our center level sponsors, Comcast, EPCO, and Train Technologies for supporting our vision. All of this is only possible because of your support. At this time, I'd like to give you a brief overview of who we are and what we do. So Georgia Tech operates two MBDA centers, the Atlanta MBDA Business Center and the Atlanta MBDA Advanced Manufacturing Center. Our mission is to help minority business enterprises, or MBEs, experience significant growth, create and retain jobs, and become sustainable, thereby having a positive effect on economic impact within communities and the nation as a whole. We are part of a national network of 35 plus centers and special projects focused specifically on growing and strengthening the minority business community, with a focus on access to capital, job opportunities, job creation and retention, technology, manufacturing, and exporting, among other things. MBDA is the only federal agency solely dedicated to the growth and global competitiveness of U.S. minority-owned businesses. MBDA recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. I also would like to take a moment to acknowledge our MBDA center staff. Brandy Nagel and Doreen Kincaid are our part-time program specialists for our Advanced Manufacturing Center team. Donna Ennis is the founder and director of our centers. We also have, as part of our team, Anita Davis and Jennifer Pasley, who work with our clients as business advisors to bring them finance and access to capital. Aisha Jones, who is on the line with us today, is the event planner for our Enterprise Innovation Institute, which is Georgia Tech's Economic Development Department, and has been a great help in putting this event series together. I also want to recognize Dr. Billy D. Brown, Anthony Jackson, and Jamarcus King, who serve as our manufacturing advisors. Finally, we have Toan Isom, who is the marketing director for our National MBE Manufacturer Summit. Feel free to reach out to our team to learn more about the MBDA or our centers and how we can assist you. So in June of 2020, the Minority Business Development Agency received funding from the CARES Act to provide assistance to the minority business community. And as a result, our MBDA centers across the country received funding to bring unique assistance and programming to you. We've launched our CARES Act Assistance Program with training and technical assistance in health and safety, cybersecurity, compliance to the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, funding identification and pivoting strategies, among other things. We're also conducting client pulse checks and will continue listening sessions and roundtables with small and minority-owned businesses to determine needs, challenges, and solutions that will ensure that our companies succeed post-COVID-19. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me or to any of our center staff. But at this time, I would like to hand things over to the Georgia Tech SHES team, starting with Brandon and Philpot.
Good morning, everybody. Well, it's afternoon. It may be morning for some people. I would like to welcome you to the Health Hazard Awareness webinar. And first off, I'd like to thank the MBDA team for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to spread the wealth and knowledge of OSHA to minority businesses and all businesses all around the country. So as I said, my name is Brandon Philpot, and I'm an industrial hygienist with the Georgia Tech Safety, Health, and Environmental Services. And and also on the line is Jenny Holroyd. She's a certified industrial hygienist, and she's the occupational health manager for our group. So today, some of the things that we're going to talk about, we're going to identify the 4 types of health hazards that are present in workplaces. We're going to discuss techniques to recognize these health hazards and describe tools and methods to evaluate these health hazards. We're also going to discuss measures to control the hazards. And we're also at the end going to give you some OSHA resources that that can help you assist with and find out more information about the hazards that we talk about or hazards that that you may face in your workplace that we may not hit on. So when we speak of health hazards, we think about 4 different types of health hazards that you will find in your workplace. Where they're chemical, physical, biological, and ergonomic. And we're going to go through each one of these 4 topics throughout this presentation. So first off, chemical hazards. And in most industry, in most facilities and job sites, chemical hazards are going to be your #1 encountered hazard in the workplace. And chemical hazards, they come in many different forms, which we'll talk about next. So chemical hazards come in several different physical forms, and the important thing about knowing these different forms is because the fact that the chemical hazard, depending on which form that it's in, it dictates how it will enter your body and what type of damage it can cause to the body. So we're going to talk about dust, fumes, mist, aerosols, fibers, and gases. So dust. So dust are solid particles that are formed by the handling and crushing, grinding, drilling, or blasting of organic and inorganic materials. When I personally think about dust, I think about silica. You also can have sawdust, as well as one of the dusts of concerns. And when you think about fumes, fumes consist of very small, fine, solid particles in the air that form when the solid particles are heated at a high temperature, then they evaporate and become solid again. And we think about fumes, we think about lead fume, and if you're doing any type of welding, after the weld is heated up, the metal is heated up, it produces a metal fume. And then we have fibers. So fibers are solid particles whose length is several times greater than their diameter. And as you see in the picture, you see how it's several times longer. And when you think of asbestos, you think of it is a ratio of 3 to 1. So it's 3 times as long as it is wide. And typically with fibers, you find fibers in construction, mining, and installation of materials. And then we have vapors. Vapors are the volatile form of substances that are normally solid or liquid at room temperature and pressure. And vapors are formed by evaporation from a liquid or a solid that could be where they could be from cleaning parts or where solvents are used. So paint solvents, and they create vapors. And gases are formless fluids that expand to occupy the space or enclosure in which they are confined to. And for gases, you think about your carbon monoxide. And think about gases, some gases displace oxygen. So you have to be really careful. That's why it's also very important when you're dealing with stuff like carbon dioxide to have meters just to make sure that the oxygen level is still high enough to be working in, because that can cause all types of health issues. So now that we have a brief overview of the different type of physical chemical hazards, how do these hazards enter the body? And chemicals enter the body in 4 different ways. You inhale it, breathing. Ingesting is drinking or eating or drinking. Skin absorption, and then you have injection. So with inhalation, that is the primary route of entry for for hazardous chemicals. And nearly all materials that are airborne can be inhaled. But the amazing thing about the body is some of the larger particles are not able to really get in harmful places because of the defenses that are naturally built into the body to help expel some of those larger particles. And the respiratory system is like I said, major route of exposure. And once a contaminant is inhaled in your respiratory system, then it may harm the tissues or the respiratory tract or the lungs and cause serious scarring, and it can even be dissolved into the rest through the blood and go to different parts of the body. And when you think about that, I think about, as I said earlier, silica, because with silica, the really tiny dust can get to the deepest parts of the lungs, which we call scarring, and which we have silicosis. And then when you have ingestion. So, excuse me. With ingestion, it's easy to, and it's easy, but it shouldn't be easy to ingest a chemical. And I say it like that because if you're doing everything right as far as making sure that people are not using secondary containers and putting chemicals in bottles that have no business having chemicals in them, then it's easy to avoid having an ingestion problem. So toxic materials, they can be swallowed and enter through the body, through the gastrointestinal tract. And like I said, sometimes people can unknowingly ingest those chemicals, and also if you're dealing with lead or anything like that, it's easier to ingest those chemicals, because sometimes the lead, if you're not fully cleaning your hands before you're eating or anything like that, you can ingest the lead. And if you're doing a process that is dealing with lead, you want to make sure that your cafeteria area, wherever your employees are eating, that it is constantly being cleaned to try to prevent some of the ingestion from possibly happening while they're eating their food. And then next we have absorption. And absorption is when the substance is absorbed through the skin. So the skin is a natural barrier of not allowing things to enter the body. But sometimes if the skin has any type of cuts or anything like that, the chemical has a route to enter. Also, some chemicals have the ability to be absorbed through the skin, through a lipid bilayer, through a lipid pathway, and through the method of diffusion, going from a place of high concentration outside of your body to a place of low concentration inside your body. So that's the fusion of diffusion of how the chemical is trying to enter the body. And then lastly, we have injection. So in many industrial settings, injection is not going to be that much of a worry because you're not dealing with needles, and but if you're working in a medical facility, that's when injection is going to be one of your top routes of entry, because the sharp object can puncture the skin and allow the chemical or infectious agent to enter the body. Okay. So your respiratory system, as I said, this is the respiratory tract. It is the major route of entry. So so the respiratory system, once it's inhaled, like I said, it can harm tissues and the respiratory tract and lung and cause serious scarring, just like when I said about silicosis. And it also can be absorbed and sent off to different parts of the body. But as I also said, the respiratory tract also has ways to, with dust and things like that, of expelling some of those larger particles so they don't get to the deepest part, but some of the final particles are able to still bypass those natural defenses that we have. So different type of health effects. Chemicals also have different type of health effects. So it can have a local effect or it can have a systemic effect. So local effects is when it only affects harms and affects the part of the body that it comes in contact with. So an example of that is like something like if acid spills on your hand, it'll just irritate that part where it came in contact with. But if you have a systemic effect, it occurs when the chemical is absorbed and it travels through your system and damages other organs. So something like this is if you inhale like a vapor, a solvent vapor, it's absorbed through the lungs, and then it can travel to your bloodstream, and it could possibly affect parts of your body like your brain. So sometimes it just depends on how that chemical moves, that it can be either local or it can be a systemic effect. So if you have an exposure, we speak of exposures like acute exposure or chronic exposure. So acute exposures generally involve short-term, high concentrations, and you have immediate or prompt health effects. So once acute exposure, within hours or a very short time period, you will see the effect of what that chemical is going to do. And if it's possibly in very high concentration, it can cause death. So as I was saying about carbon monoxide, the lower levels, you could start having illnesses and you have dizziness, but at very high concentrations, it can cause death of a person. Or you have your chronic exposure. So chronic exposure refers to exposures continued or repeated for prolonged periods, and usually years. And a lot of times people don't know that they are being exposed to this, or they know they're being exposed to this, but they don't know it's actually causing a problem, because you won't see this come up for years and years and years and years. And with the fact that something needs to be chronic is very, I think it's very disheartening, because sometimes we go visit companies and you tell some employees, yeah, you need to wear your respirator, support to wear your respirator. And then they go with the thing of, I've been doing this for 30 years and I'm not sick. Just because you're not sick now doesn't mean later you don't have the ability to become sick. So you have to just really remember that everything is not going to show up right away. It may take years and years to actually show up that an actual negative effect is happening from whatever process you were doing. So where do you find all this information about different health hazards? So a great place to start is the SDS for whatever chemical that you're using. So the SDS gives you detailed information, and it's provided by whoever manufactures or imports the product. And it lists the physical and chemical properties along with the health hazards, the routes of exposure, precautions of how to safely handle it, and emergency and first aid procedures and control measures. And before they had the SDS sheets, they had the MSDS sheets, was the material safety data sheets. And they are the same, but the SDS sheets are just laid out in a specific order. So no matter what product you look at on the SDS, is going to be in the same order. So it makes finding information a whole lot simpler than what it was with looking on the SDS, the MSDS. So if you have any products in your facility, you really need to contact your supplier and make sure that they are supplying you SDS sheets now instead of MSDS sheets, because this is part of the global harmonization system, just to make sure no matter where the product is coming from around the world, that all the information is going to be on that sheet and in the same order. And this is right here is just giving you more of the background of what you will see on the SDS sheets, like identification, the hazard identification, composition, first aid measures. And also the SDS sheets must be in English, and the information regarding the specific chemical identity of the hazardous chemicals that are and the common names should also be provided on the SDS sheets. Well, will be provided on the SDS sheets. So a couple of biological hazards that you may face, depending on what industry you are actually in. You can have your bacteria, your viruses, or your fungi. So biological health hazards are including the bacteria, the virus, and the fungi and of any other living organism that may cause acute or chronic infections if it enters the body, either through either directly or through breaks of the skin. And there are over 200 different biological agents that are known to produce an infectious or toxic or carcinogenic reaction in workers. And if you typically deal with plants or animals or in the food industry, you can be possibly, or in the medical industry, you could be possibly exposed to biological hazards. Also, if you're working in labs, you can be also exposed to biological hazards. And then you have, and any occupations that result in contacts with body fluids, such as any medical people, or if you're doing any type of first aid, you pose a risk for having to be exposed to a biological hazard. And if you have the possibility of being exposed to a biological hazard, you really need to be up on your bloodborne pathogens. And bloodborne pathogens is designed to protect workers from the risk of exposure to biological agents. And the standard is just lays out what should be done and what is necessary as far as making sure that all workers are protected, whether it is making sure that you are properly disposing of any type of needles and making sure that everything is labeled properly in biohazard bags, and making sure that employees are trained properly on how to properly handle themselves when they are in contact with bloods by wearing the proper PPE to really protect themselves and to treat whoever they need to treat for whatever reason. So there's also some physical health hazards that we're going to discuss. So we're going to talk about some noise hazards, some ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, and we're going to talk about temperature extremes. And if you joined Jenny and I on this past Friday, we talked a little bit about the temperature extreme hazards. So with noise is unwanted sound, and it is one of the most pervasive occupational health problems, and it's the byproduct of many industrial processes. And sound consists of pressure changes caused by vibration or turbulence. And as you see with this chart, you see that some basic noise meters. So if a jet taking off, that's between 120 and 130 decibels. And that is extremely loud. That's something that you should not be around without, you should not be around that without having some type of hearing protection in, because noise sounds at that levels can induce hearing loss, because naturally, as we age, you're going to naturally lose some of your hearing, but we don't want that process to be sped up because we are not being cautious enough when we're by extremely loud sounds. So I see a vacuum cleaner can be about 70 to 80 decibels. And if you want a lot more information about noise, we do a one-day course, and we have a self-guided course that goes through all the hazards and controls that are related to noise. And then we have temperature extremes. So temperature extremes can affect the amount of work that people are able to do, because faster you work, the hotter you get. If it's already hot in your facility, you can result in heat stress, and often high temperature is more a problem rather than working at lower temperatures. And operations that typically have high temperatures include, if you're working in the middle of summer in Georgia on construction sites or iron and steel foundries, glass production facilities, and rubber products factories and bakeries. So you just want to really be adept on the knowing the signs if someone has some type of distress, whether it's hot or cold, and make sure that your employees are trained on the proper things of making sure that they stay hydrated while they are doing any type of job that they're doing, and just give them the power to make sure that if they get overheated and they think they're getting too hot, to take a break and just cool off for a second, because heat illness can be 100% prevented if you give people the right tools to prevent that. So radiation sources are found on a wide range of settings, of occupation settings. If radiation is not properly controlled, it can be potentially hazardous to the health of the workers. So with radiation, you just want to make sure that if you know that there's potential for radiation exposure, you want to make sure that you're properly monitoring it with monitors, just to ensure that the employees are not being overexposed to radiation in any type of way. My dad worked on the building the nuclear, some of the nuclear reactors in South Carolina, North Augusta, and sometimes the people out there will wear a monitor to ensure that they are not being overexposed to radiation. So also with a lot of places, no matter what type of industry, sometimes you have your ergonomic health hazards. So with ergonomics is the science that study and evaluates the full range of tasks, but it's not limited to lifting, holding, pushing, reaching, and repetitive motion. And with ergonomics is you want to make sure that people are lifting properly, or if they are working at a bench, make sure that they're not having to lean too far over in order to perform their task. Because a lot of times with ergonomics, with ergonomic issues, you have a lot of strains and pulls and muscle aches because they're not doing it properly. So repetitive motions or repeated shocks over prolonged periods of times. So if someone is sorting or assembling or doing data entry, can cause irritation and inflammation in the tendons. And that's how that could possibly result in carpal tunnel syndrome. So you want to make sure that they're doing everything, for lack of better words, in an ergonomic way to ensure that they are comfortable while doing their job and they're not putting any extra strain on their body while they're doing whatever task that they're doing. So this is all that I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Jenny. And as I said, Jenny is the occupational health manager for our group. Take it away, Jenny.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here today. And we're going to be talking, Brandon gave a great overview of the different categories of occupational health and what we would refer to as industrial hygiene hazards. Brandon and I are both industrial hygienists, and if you've never heard that term before, it's basically a person who goes out to all different types of businesses, whether it's retail or an industrial plant, and we look at what are the exposures that workers might come in contact with and how we can protect people from those hazards. And part of that is this idea of recognition of hazards. And both Brandon and I work for the Georgia Tech Osha Consultation program, which is a free on-site compliance assistance program where we go out to companies that are small businesses, and a small business is defined as a business with less than 250 workers at one site and less than 500 workers in the controlled corporation. And we go out to all different kinds of companies, poultry processing plants, funeral homes, foundries. I went to a t-shirt company, lots of different companies that we go to. And when we go out to them, we are walking around. Now, we never go around and sniff or smell chemicals per se, but I'm always acutely aware of what I smell in the air to see what I need to start doing a little bit more investigating on. If you get a taste in your mouth, I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you, that is a clear indicator there is something there. But we're really concerned about things like particles getting into the respiratory system. And those particles could be something like COVID-19 particles, the virus itself getting into your lungs, or they could be something more mundane, like fibers from a fabric. Or they could be something very toxic, like silica dust. So there's a wide range of concerns, and how hazardous it is really depends on if your body is able to fight it off and get it out if they need to. We are aware that something may cause harm if we see immediate effects, but that doesn't necessarily mean, as Brandon explains, that chronic conditions sometimes can start occurring, and the process of illness begins 10, 15, 30 years before you actually see clinical level illness. It's always a good indicator when I go out into a company and they have skylights and I'm able to see the dust particles refracting in the light. So visible dust in the air is an indicator. And then I also look around. I don't touch as many surfaces as I used to, but I do go out to companies and I perform wipe samples so that I can see how much dust has settled, and we can send those wipe samples off to the lab for analysis to see what has actually settled, if it's toxic chemicals or maybe heavy metals. But we can also do a visual show you that if we wipe and you see a big difference between the other surface and the surface that we wiped, you can tell that maybe housekeeping is not functioning properly. To do this, there's a whole variety of different types of equipment and tools we use. And so some of those things include using sound level meters, where we go out and measure how loud it is. We use detector tubes and pumps and all sorts of fun equipment, or fun to me, maybe not fun to you, where we take media, so little filters and glass vial tubes with charcoal in them, and we collect samples and send them off to a lab for analysis to see whether or not there is a level of contaminant that is cause for concern. And we can also take out things like radiation survey meters or real-time monitors, where we are reading what's out there. And we have a variety of different real-time monitors where we measure the carbon dioxide in the air, the humidity, how many feet per second the air is moving to test for ventilation. We can test for a variety of organic solvents, and we have some real-time dust monitors. And then when we collect all this data, as part of the Osha Consultation program, and also if you hire an industrial hygienist, we're going to send you a report. And the report is going to have a ton of information, but one of the key elements of that information is we're going to tell you how much the lab was able to determine was in the air. And that's going to be a complicated measure between how long we did the sample, how much air volume we pulled through the filter or tube to measure the volume of air that was measured. And then the lab analyzes how much they identified. And we take all those factors and combine them together. Sometimes we work in using the molecular weight of the element we're analyzing into that calculation. And we come up with a way to quantify how much was there. And for gases and vapors, we typically report it back in parts per million. So if you imagine the air, it would be how many particles are in a million particles and million parts per air. And then in the milligrams per cubic meter, we're looking at a cubic meter of air and how many milligrams of that contaminant was in the air. And then for asbestos fibers, and typically all fibers, they literally count how many fibers are on the filter. So you'd get a count of how many fibers you would see per cubic centimeter. And then these values, whatever they may be, are compared against, if you're looking at OSHA regulatory terms, a permissible exposure limit. And it's really an impermissible exposure limit, because what you're trying to identify is where can you not go over. However, I do want to stress that the permissible exposure limit is based off of, well, the vast majority of OSHA permissible exposure limits were based off of the science from the 60s. And many of the contaminants that have permissible exposure limits have not been updated since OSHA was created in 1970. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the permissible exposure limit. Some of the substance-specific standards have more recent permissible exposure limits. However, even still, permissible exposure limits are not a limit in which you say below which I'll be safe. It just means that for a certain percentage of the population, they weren't affected if you were below that limit. So that's a really important factor to consider. In industrial hygiene, we never say you're safe at a certain level because everybody has different body types. You have different genetic backgrounds. You've had different exposures leading up to that point, which may be able to trigger a reaction to certain contaminants. So we stay away from that word safe. However, we recommend, because of how old a lot of these standards are, looking at some of the other areas or organizations that propose guidance on exposure limits. So the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, they have a listing of threshold limit values. These are the values that they believe are, and they tend to be much more conservative than the OSHA ones, meaning they're lower. Would be more protective of workers. And then NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and that is the research arm of OSHA, and it's housed within the CDC. And researchers there are able to do research, and they don't have to deal with the compliance issues, and they don't have to deal with the regulatory process of promulgating a rule or a law. They can put in their recommendations. One thing to point out with NIOSH's recommended exposure limits, or RELs, is they take a really hard stance on anything that's identified as a carcinogen. Anything identified as a carcinogen, they will say that there is no level that's considered safe. And that is a unique distinction that they're able to make because they do not have to take into account economic feasibility when they make their recommendations, which OSHA does have to do an economic feasibility study. And then there's the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and they also have workplace limits, though they're not used quite as frequently. And so I already went through all of this. So you have the threshold limit values. I will say that they publish their values on a yearly basis, and you can purchase, I have a thing up, but you can purchase a book, a little guidebook that tells you what the threshold limit values are. Because it is a private nonprofit association, and it's a group of researchers that come up with these, and scientists, you do have to purchase that book. The recommended exposure limits are found on the NIOSH website, and they have this thing called the Pocket Guide to Chemical Hazards. You used to get paper copies, then we got CDs, and now you just go onto their website and you look up the Pocket Guide. And the Pocket Guide, which used to be a little pocket-sized booklet, but now is electronic, you can look up a chemical and it'll tell you lots of information. The recommended exposure limit, but it also gives guidance on recommended respiratory protection for a particular chemical, what to do in case of an emergency or spill. So there's and how it affects you from a toxicology standpoint. So lots of good information to gain from the Pocket Guide. And Brandon, if you could put a link to the Pocket Guide in the chat window, that would be really helpful. And with the workplace environmental exposure level guides, they're developed for agents that currently have no exposure guidelines established for other organizations. And this is really work in a working group, and they a lot of times will give you guidance on how to really perform an assessment when there's very little known about a chemical. Oftentimes chemicals are pushed out into the economy before we really understand how they affect our bodies. And so part of the American Industrial Hygiene Association is to research that. So because this is really looking at ones where there aren't guidelines, it's continually evolving. And so they're not typically used from a regulatory standpoint, but very much so by a guidance area. And really the quintessential way and manner that I would address a hazard if I went out to your facility is I would look at the hierarchy of controls. So before we even get to engineering controls, I would say to myself, all right, you're working with this chemical and it's toxic. What can we do? Can you remove it from the environment totally? Can we substitute and find a lesser harmful chemical? And a good example of that is anti-splatter is a product that's used when during welding. And there's a whole variety of different types of anti-splatter. And unfortunately, there is one particular type of anti-splatter that contains methylene chloride. Methylene chloride is a toxic chemical. It's a carcinogen. It's really bad for your liver, really bad for your reproductive system. And it is easily and readily available to get into your body and to the target organs if it gets on your skin. So that means if you're spraying this chemical on a surface so that you have a better welding surface, if you happen to get any overspray on your wrists or arms or any skin that's not covered or protected, it'll go through your skin and then travel to different regions of your body, particularly like your liver. That said, they make anti-splatter that doesn't contain it that works just as well. And it's a quick and simple substitution that really prevents and removes. But oftentimes, like a welder will go and bring it into the work environment because he's always used it. And the people that are managing health and safety at a company won't necessarily know that that product's even there. And so that's bad for two reasons. One, the number one reason is the worker might be getting exposed and potentially harmed. But the second reason would be because if OSHA were to inspect you and see a product that contains something that has its own substance specific standard and all sorts of rules and requirements, you could potentially be cited for those issues. And then once you go beyond substitution or elimination of the hazard, we look at things like engineering controls, which would be installing ventilation systems, putting up different guarding to protect you from the exposure to the hazard. Then work practice controls, we're seeing a lot of that with COVID. Work practice controls would be an example of having people spread out and not work more than 6 feet apart. Then there would be administrative control. So an administrative control is training your workers, adjusting work schedules so there's not quite as many people in an environment, and then you have personal protective equipment. And personal protective equipment includes respiratory protection, gloves, shoes, materials or clothing you might have to wear to make it safer for the work environment, hard hats, a whole host of things that you can wear to protect your body. And different types of engineering controls include enclosing the hazard. So that would be if you have a generator type machinery that is very loud. You may put it in its own room to separate it from the rest of the workforce because people don't need to work on it very often. And so then you have one room where all the noise is enclosed, and then the other workers wouldn't be exposed to that hazard. And isolation is similar to enclosure. But you're really trying to put that in an area that is not around where the other workers are. So you may not be physically enclosing it, but moving it much further away. And then I already discussed ventilation systems. With work practice controls, other ways that we look at work practice controls, and many times when I go out to a company to perform an industrial hygiene assessment, I'll just stand there and watch the workers as they're working. And what I'm looking for are just the way that they're working to see if we can adjust it to reduce the exposure. If we could establish better housekeeping procedures to also reduce the exposure. Do they need to perform maintenance on the machinery to make it not rattle so much and not be as loud? And are there procedural changes that could remove or practically eliminate the hazard itself? And what this picture is showing is if you're cleaning metal products, and this would be dipping it into a dip tank of some sort, and they're in a basket that would be put into that container. Simply putting those products so that the majority of the area, if you put them upside down, when you pull them up, there'll be residual chemical, whatever you're putting it in to clean it, inside the containers when you pull it up, and that will be able to put vapors in the air. Whereas if you have them upside down, you're going to pretty much eliminate that hazard. And with administrative controls, we use that through work shifts and scheduling. And we refer to this sometimes as job rotation. It is a way to remove somebody from a hazard for a period of time so that their body can heal itself and get better. And then when they go back in, they'll be ready for that. And the different types of personal protective equipment, there's lots of different ones that are available. And the nice thing about personal protective equipment is, unlike this retro picture that we've included in our presentation, there's a lot more aesthetically pleasing personal protective equipment items that you can purchase. So when I got my first pair of steel-toed shoes 20 years ago, they were just your regular old boots, but now I've got a nice pair of Keen steel-toed shoes that look like a fancy pair of hiking boots, and they're really comfortable. So you kind of are getting the best of both worlds. So when people say they don't want to wear personal protective equipment, I challenge them that there is going to be a type of PPE out there that will work for them. Other things to consider is oftentimes we will look at localizing the exposure control. And so we would refer to this as localized exhaust ventilation. And what you're trying to do is not have to move so much air to remove the hazard, but get right close to where that hazard is and remove the potential exposures. For biological hazard controls, one element you may want to consider is for people who are using diabetic syringes or may have to use syringes for other medical conditions, or you may be concerned with other reasons why there may be sharps in the workplace, you can hang up and secure sharps containers in the restroom so that people have a safe place to dispose of them, because it isn't the user that would be exposed. It would be your housekeeping staff that would be removing the trash that might have a sharps container that was not properly disposed of, that would enter that work environment. With physical hazards, we could really completely go into this for a much longer time, but I am running out of time. So I am going to go through this of where you can find more information. And so you can go to the Osha website, but you can also contact our on-site consultation program, which is at oshainfo.gautech.edu. And I am going to put that into the chat window, and then I'm going to turn it back over to the everyone else, and I will be quiet now, so I'm out of time.
All right, so first of all, thank you, Brandon and Jenny, for your presentation. At this time, I do want to begin our Q&A. If anyone in attendance has a question, you can raise your hand or you can put a question in the Q&A box. It doesn't look like we have any questions at this time. Brandon, actually, I did have a quick question, and maybe this will kick things off. Can you speak a little more about radiation exposure? Because I know there's different types of radiation that you should be careful of, especially when it comes to chronic and prolonged exposure. I guess, would this be something that is mostly concerning people who practice in medicine? Like the example I'm thinking of is chemotherapy. When you're transporting chemotherapy, or I guess, can you just speak a little more about that? The different types of radiation that you have to be careful of?
As far as dealing with chemotherapy, I'm not too sure on that. Maybe Jenny, you know a little bit more about that.
So there's two primary classes of radiation exposure. There's ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, and they all can both can be harmful, but cause different kinds of harm. And it gets down to the physics and the chemistry of the radiation particles and whether they hit your skin and stop and then potentially cause damage to the DNA structure there, or if they're able to go right through your body and cause harm.
Right.
So there's two main classes, and it's not just in medicine that you have to be concerned about radiation. There's a lot of industries that use X-ray systems to check the integrity of their equipment, and so they would have to deal with radiation potential exposure. And it's a really complex topic, and would require a consultation with a expert in the field to come out and assess that. But that's something where maintenance of equipment's really important, because as the equipment gets older, there's more potential for those radiation particles to escape.
Okay. That was a question I wanted to ask, because I personally know my mother was a chemotherapy nurse in the 70s, and, you know, they didn't wear the protective equipment back then. And so you have years down the line, as a result of chronic exposure, things like cancer or autoimmune diseases coming up. And when you talk about consultations, if people who are in attendance were interested, they could schedule a consultation with somebody on your team, right? Depending upon like what it is they need assistance with.
Right. And we are doing both virtual visits and in-person visits. And just to point out, with the OSHA consultation program, we can perform all of our air monitoring for free, which is a huge benefit. If I were a private IH, I'd probably charge you. We always calculate it out sometimes what we would charge if we were private. Couple $1,000, between $5,000 and $10,000 to go out and do air sampling for a day for a company. So it's a huge benefit to companies to use our program.
And I'll add on that. So our program, the Georgia Tech one, is strictly for Georgia. So if anybody else is around in any other state, if you go to the OSHA website, you can find the program that's for your state.
All right, thank you, Jenny and Brandon, for answering that question. I am going to turn it back over to the audience. Does anybody have any questions at this time? You can raise your hands or put it in the Q&A box. Because if not, I'm going to discuss upcoming events and then close out. But I wanted to give anybody who had a question a chance to speak up and do so. Billy D has his hand raised.
I'll unmute him. 1 second. Okay, Billy D.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. My headset is working. Now, I was just curious when you mentioned the air monitoring program. So how would you get started with that if you wanted to get the free air sampling for a business?
So Brandon put the link to our website in the chat window, and in there, if you go to the website, you can request consultation. And once you put in a request, you'll be assigned 2 people. You'll be assigned a safety consultant and a health consultant. The safety person will look at your machine guarding, any safety hazards, and then the industrial hygienist will contact you, and then we'll start a dialogue and conversation about what your needs are. And it's free and confidential.
And what are the range of substances that will be monitored in the air? Would that include nanoparticulates as well? Or?
That's a great question. So because it's a OSHA sponsored program, we monitor for that which is regulated by OSHA. And currently nanoparticles are not regulated by OSHA. We can give guidance about what to do, but we do not have the equipment to sample for nanoparticles. But welding fumes, solvent scans, dust, silica, asbestos, there's a large amount of chemicals we can sample for.
Got it. And have you, just as a side question, have you heard of 3D printers generating a lot of particulates in the air? Because I was kind of working with a company with this and a professor at Georgia Tech that published in that area. So it kind of informed me that that was a concern actually in his publication, that there's a lot of particles being generated by these 3D printers. And I'm not sure how hazardous they are.
Actually, let me look this up because we made a tech guide on 3D printing. And we'll be able to give you a resource right now. And they can be, it depends on the material you are using to do the printing. So that is one of the driving factors. So let me see if I can find that, and I'll put that in the chat window in the next minute or so.
Okay, thank you.
It looks like Sunny has a question. Hold on a second.
Hello.
Hold on a second. We got a couple of,
Sunny,
first of all, to answer the question I see in the Q&A, it says, where can we look for the presentation slides? I had neglected to mention this at the beginning, but the recording of this presentation, as well as the slides, will be made available to attendees after the fact. It might be a few days, since I know the video recording takes a little while to process and edit, but this will be available for attendees. And then, so that's Sandra's question. And then Sunny says, will the air testing help in developing a respirator change guide?
and Lauren, I unmuted. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay, yeah. So, yeah, Sunny, if you want to like elaborate on your question or just state it again, that's fine.
Oh, okay. So I'm working on getting our company's respirator program together, and I noticed that on the change log, like it specifies that you have to develop it either by like using math or like a qualitative air sampling thing. So my question is, like, with the air sampling that y'all provide, would that help in doing that?
Yes, the answer is yes. I was giving you a chance, Brandon.
I'll say.
Yes, we can help you do those calculations and also give you rules of thumb and work you through that. It can be really tricky and complicated too, especially if you're dealing with a lot of chemicals. You have to take into account how there might be an additive effect of all those chemicals together, might use up the respirator at a quicker rate.
Awesome, thanks.
All right, so any other questions at this time? Last chance for anybody who hasn't participated or has a question on their mind for the Georgia Tech SHES team.
Lauren, I don't have a question, but I kind of have like a statement. So a friend of mine,
Sure.
a friend of mine delivers radiation medicine for cancer patients all around the state to hospitals. And I noticed that he has a little thing around his neck that detects the radiation levels. And so I thought that was interesting, Jenny, when you said that you just really have to take good care of your materials and things like that. So like if, I guess if the boxes are like defective or anything like that, it could be pretty dangerous.
Exactly. And he's wearing a dosimeter and it's measuring the quantity of exposure. And you have a maximum amount of exposure you can have at any given time. And then there's also an amount you can have cumulative over a period of time. And so that will alert him and his employer if there's a hazard, like the boxes that they transport it in aren't working. And then if he is overexposed, they will be able to work on either treating him or removing him from the hazard till his body has time to repair itself.
Actually, I did have a question. When it comes to like physical or chemical irritants, is acute exposure more of a concern, or is chronic exposure what tends to cause a lot of damage or danger?
Both.
So there's not like one, you don't see cases of one more than the other necessarily?
So we know the acute exposures. We know if when the poultry plant up in Gainesville had their leak and they had all the fatalities the other week, that was an acute exposure to nitrogen. They were asphyxiated. That we know for sure. So acute exposures, you know. If you get a chemical burn, you know it. If you pull out your back, you know it. What's really hard, and both emotionally and psychologically, physically, is if you end up with a lung cancer diagnosis, or you're diagnosed with COPD, and you worked in a couple different places, and now you think that your workplace exposure may have contributed to your illness, and now you have these mounting medical bills. But it's really hard to prove that your lung cancer was caused by that exposure because there's so many other things that cause lung cancer.
Right.
So it's terrible if you retire and you end up dying of cancer with no way to pay for things, which is why we're so passionate about preventing people from ever getting to that place. And we don't know the true count of how many people get sick from workplace exposures because there isn't a national surveillance system for illnesses. Like reporters report back what injuries happen at work and what illnesses happen at work, but if an illness happens 30 years later, they're not going to report it. So we don't really have a clear idea.
Right. Sunny did have another question. Sunny,
Okay.
there you are.
Yes, I was just curious, what are some easy and quick things that we could add to a workflow to help with any ergonomic issues? I know y'all mentioned like making sure that if they're at a desk, things are within reach, but is it like making like breaks, making sure that those are involved? Like what are some things to help?
I think the most important thing that people can do from an ergonomics perspective is every day when they get to work, before they're doing activities, whether it's hard physical labor or sitting at a desk all day, do a quick 5-minute check-in on their body. So warming up, you're not really stretching, but you're moving your body to see if there's any issues as a baseline. And then throughout the day, taking rest breaks where you stretch and move your body. Those are two simple ways you can keep an eye out, because early reporting of ergonomic injuries is the best way to avoid severe injury and really big claims.
All right. So I guess any other questions or comments before we close out? Sunny, you're still, do you have another question? You're still showing up as a, question on my feed.
Well, I guess I did sort of have a follow-up, I guess, to that. So if we have employees who have in the past had like back issues, but they a part of their job is still like dealing with lifting, like what are some things to do to help alleviate that, I guess?
That is where it gets a lot trickier because if they're already injured, they may not, if they had been injured in the past, they may not be completely healed. And so you may want to look at accommodations or tools that can be provided to them to help alleviate the need for them to use their back for lifting. So that would be the engineering controls aspect. You also may want to look at how you could help them strengthen their core muscles so that they wouldn't have as much impact on their back.
Okay. So I guess before we wrap up, any more questions? Let's see. Aisha, do you see any more questions?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right, then I guess at this time, I'll start just by explaining and drawing attention to some upcoming events. So tomorrow, for anybody who is interested, we are having another webinar in our CARES Act training and development series. It's going to be with Teresa Cummings of Cummings Consulting and Management. And it'll be about leading employee engagement using human and business strategies. That'll be tomorrow at 1 p.m. This is going to be her third webinar in a series of 3, and the past 2 have been really engaging and enjoyable. So if you haven't signed up already, I would encourage you to do so. The link's at the bottom of the slide. We also do have some more webinars and things coming up in our series with Georgia Tech, the Georgia Tech Safety, Health, and Environmental Services team. Next Tuesday, March 2nd, is that next Tuesday? That's unbelievable. Next Tuesday, March 2nd, we will be having a walking working surfaces standard webinar. And we will be going over OSHA subpart D surfaces on walking working surfaces. It's free to attend, like all webinars in this series, but you must register. And you can register at walkingworkingsurfaces.eventbrite.com. And that'll be next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We also do have a third roundtable consultation coming up. We'll be having a hazardous materials safety roundtable next Friday from 10 to 11 a.m. But you must register to attend. So there's links at the bottom of the slides where you can go to register. And if you are interested in getting any of these links, you can shoot me an email as well. That's it. So I wanted to, first of all, before we close things out, thank Brandon and Jenny both for delivering this presentation today and for joining us. Wanted to thank Aisha, as usual, for helping us put these events together. And I wanted to thank everybody who attended. We hope to see you at future events at the Walking Working Surfaces webinar and for our roundtable series.